Thank you, and welcome everyone to this wonderful discussion. We will begin right away with Strobe, who will give us his views on the new America. So, Strobe.
Thank you very much, Manjeet. Are the acoustics okay? Terrific. Well, why don't I start with a rather busy day in America's life about 4 weeks ago, November 8th, Election Day. It was almost across the board Where were we? Is that okay? All right. Across the board, all the predictions were that Hillary Clinton was going to win this hard-fought campaign that has taken up almost 2 years of our political life in the United States. And when I say across the board, it also was almost a foregone conclusion in the Trump campaign that he would be making a concession speech at some point during that night. I, like so many other Americans, although I wish there had been more, went to the polling booths early that morning and cast my ballot, and I got a little sticker that said, "I voted." I did a little work at Brookings, and then I headed to the airport to fly to Mexico City, of all places. I got on a plane at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and already the exit polls indicated that indeed Secretary Clinton would win. There was no Wi-Fi on the plane, and I had a homework assignment from our Uber organizer and hostess, Bachi, who may be here in the audience. And the homework assignment was for me to give a talk about what let's call it the Clinton 45 presidency would look like. So I used most of that 5-hour flight to write about somebody, namely Mrs. Clinton, whom I have known for 45 years, before she was Mrs. Clinton, by the way. I was in the passport line in Mexico City Airport when I was catching up on my emails and also looking at the returns, and something very unexpected was happening. The electoral map, and we'll come back to that in a minute, was turning more and more red, particularly in the Midwest, where I'm from, Ohio, and in some of the mountain states out west, and of course, throughout much of the South. So, this turned out to be, first of all, a wasted 4 hours on my part, writing about Mrs. Clinton's presidency, but much more importantly, it was a stunner for the nation and a stunner, I think, for many, many people around the world who were watching. But it wasn't just a big surprise. The presidential election of 2016 in the United States was unprecedented in several ways. One, the loser, Secretary Clinton, beat the winner, Donald Trump, by 2.5 million votes cast by citizens. In all of our previous 56 elections, going back to the beginning of the United States, no candidate has ever lost the popular vote by so large a margin and still won in the Electoral College. Let me give you a little bit of background on that peculiar institution that meets for one day every 4 years. The American founding fathers came up with the idea of the Electoral College in 1787. They did so for a variety of reasons connected with their concept of federalism and states' rights. But they had another purpose in mind, too. They wanted a backstop or a filter to prevent populists or unfit candidates from reaching the highest office in the land. Early in our history, in the first half of the 19th century, the Electoral College exercised that prerogative on several occasions. But over time, it became a rubber stamp. You've no doubt seen articles about recounts and electors breaking with tradition and putting Secretary Clinton in the White House even now. But that is a fantasy. When the electors convene 2 weeks from now, they will formally confirm Mr. Trump's victory. Never mind that the president-elect is a textbook populist who entered the race without any background in any public office. On top of that, he was pitted against a rival with 30 years of experience in public life, including as a senator and, of course, Secretary of State. And yet, he still won. So why did that happen? Here are some factors. Many Americans feel marginalized, if not victimized, by globalization and the technological revolution. The election gave them a means of expressing their discontent with the present and their fear of the future. Partly for that reason, the extreme, unrelenting negativity of this campaign worked to Mr. Trump's advantage and against Secretary Clinton's. He was the ultimate protest candidate. His status as a brash outsider was a plus, since professional politicians are not held in very high repute in the United States these days. Mrs. Clinton's long time in public life turned out to be a liability, with voters who wanted to shake things up, which Mr. Trump promised to do. In addition, her campaign was hobbled by miscalculations about how to concentrate her get-out-the-vote efforts and her difficulty in finding a simple, uplifting articulation of her goals. On top of that, Mr. Trump was successful in keeping alive the controversy over Secretary Clinton's emails that dogged her to the very bitter end. And it was a bitter end for her. In the final weeks, Russia dumped yet another trove of her emails via WikiLeaks. And the director of the FBI announced that they might have relevance to a future criminal case. It was the ultimate October surprise. The FBI director's reversal came too late to make any difference. Secretary Clinton was like a marathoner tripped up just short of the finish line. As a result, 47 days from today, Mr. Trump will be inaugurated as the Chief Executive and Commander-in-Chief of the United States and a major actor on the world stage. The morning after her defeat, Secretary Clinton joined President Obama in urging all Americans to give Mr. Trump a chance to govern wisely. That is, of course, exactly the right and patriotic thing to do. American citizens are overwhelmingly trying to live up to that admonition. But a great many of them will do so with a degree of trepidation unlike anything that we have seen in our lifetimes, and I would say in our history. That's partly because Mr. Trump is a political newcomer, untested in his previous career. But it's also because of the way he conducted himself in his debut as a politician and the means he used to ultimately prevail. A personal reflection here, if I may. I've been in and around my country's politics since 1964. I interned that year at the Republican convention in San Francisco that nominated Barry Goldwater. I'm sure you all remember that he too was a controversial figure himself, but nothing compared to Mr. Trump. And he lost in a landslide in the general election to Lyndon Johnson. Since then, I've watched 12 subsequent campaigns closely and covered several of them as a journalist. There has never been one like this one. As all of us know, when it comes to picking national leadership, politics is not about compromise. It's a zero-sum game. The players play to win. Winners exult, and so do their supporters. Losers are deflated, as are their backers. But the mood in America in this election year, during the campaign and its aftermath, has unsettled the nation to a unique extent. For one thing, Mr. Trump won both the nomination and the general election as a polarizer, and he has remained so since his victory. The polarization is deeper and wider than the competition between our two major parties. The Trump phenomenon is, in essence, bipartisan, if not post-partisan. To wit, he carried states in the general election that had been Democratic bastions in past elections, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Yet at the same time, he was opposed vigorously, I would even say anathematized, by both living Republican former presidents, the Bushes, father and son. Both previous Republican candidates of 2008 and 2012, John McCain and Mitt Romney. And his first choice, Mr. Trump's first choice, to be his running mate, John Kasich, the governor of my home state, Ohio, also wanted nothing to do with the Trump candidacy. In fact, on Election Day, Governor Kasich wrote in Senator McCain's name on his ballot. The alienation of Republicans was largely because Mr. Trump tore up the rule book of political discourse, making the 2016 campaign, both in the primaries and in the general election, the nastiest in our history. His route to the White House was littered with gobsmacking insults, reckless proposals, impossible promises, serial commissions of facticide, and dog whistling to racists, anti-Semites, xenophobes in general, and Islamophobes in particular. He also had his own version of the theme of this conference, that man-woman thing, a topic that we'll discuss this afternoon in a panel on gender in the campaign, when my wife, Barbara, will have some observations of her own. Now, granted, since his election, Mr. Trump has modified or hinted he might jettison several of his most controversial statements and plans. He has backed away somewhat from denial of climate change. He's backed away from the efficacy of waterboarding and torture, and he has modified his plan for the big, beautiful wall on our southern border. But there are still many Americans who are, for the first time in their lives, worried about the soul of our country. Their worry goes beyond specific policies. It goes to their uncertainty about his understanding of and commitment to our Constitution, which, of course, has many similarities to India's. When Mr. Trump becomes President Trump on Inauguration Day, he will take an oath to uphold, preserve, and protect the letter and spirit of that founding document of our country. Yet he has, over the last year plus, repeatedly, including in the month since his election, made statements and threats that, if carried out, would violate our Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment's protection of freedom of speech and freedom of press. A related responsibility that comes with the keys to the Oval Office is that the occupant of that office is sworn to respect and protect all American citizens. Our Constitution, like yours, begins with three words: we the people. We, plural, people, singular. The very grammar of that phrase binds all Americans, just as it binds all Indians to a concept of a capacious, inclusive national identity. In that regard, the world's oldest and largest democracies have, from our respective struggles for independence, strived to embrace the diversity of our citizenry as an enrichment of our polity and our society. That ideal motivated our founders. And therein is the rub in what is already referred to as Trumpism. As a candidate, I repeat, as a candidate, the man himself seemed not to be so motivated. Take the slogan emblazoned on his red baseball cap. We all know it: "Make America Great Again." The subtext of those 4 words has been a signal to many of his followers. It implies the restoration of an America in which real Americans are white, Christian, descended from immigrants from Europe. In short, an America that favors people like Mr. Trump himself in those respects, and, I must confess, people like me. But that's not my America, nor is it the America of Fareed Zakaria or my Brookings colleague Dhruva Jaishankar, who lived 17 years in the US. Both have written passionately on this subject. They are not just concerned about Mr. Trump's deliberate appeal to nativism within the United States. They, like many others, see a projection of that domestic polarizing vision into Mr. Trump's worldview. Again, a caveat. In the realm of foreign policy, we don't know for certain what Mr. Trump will do as president. But we do know what he has said about what guides him, and it's worrisome. He seems to admire authoritarian leaders. He has a sense of kinship with ultranationalists. Many of the governments around the world are rattled, worried, and frightened, particularly those that are allies of the United States on the other side of the North Atlantic and on the other side of the Pacific. This is not just a regional concern. It has a global dimension as well. On the hustings and in his interviews, Mr. Trump put us on notice over and over again that he was inclined, and maybe still inclined, to part company with from his 12 predecessors since the end of World War II, 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. Every one of those previous presidents has made it his business to help create, buttress, and strengthen a liberal world order. Until recently, that endeavor had been making considerable progress. They'd been doing so over a number of decades, not least because emerging powers were taking their seats at the high table of global governance, helping us to transition from a mid-20th century world order to a 21st century international system. India is one of the most conspicuous and successful examples. It has been an active leader and beneficiary of the progress through its membership in the G20, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and other multilateral organizations, notably including the United Nations. But now, that order seems to be unraveling. All of that progress towards integration in the last century and in the first decade of this one has, in a few short years, given